Inside a tropical forest, a crowd of people are gathered around a crashed airplane. From a distance, it's possible to make out the mangled wreckage of white and yellow metal surrounded by tall banana plants. But a closer look, beyond the crowd of firefighters, police and TV news reporters, reveals something strange about this crash site in Haiti, in the Caribbean. On the ground, surrounding the wreckage, are thousands of tiny worm-like creatures, 4 centimetres long and pale in colour, almost translucent. Some are still moving, wriggling and flipping around. It appears the private plane was carrying a shipment of live baby eels, part of a lucrative and sometimes illegal global trade. For the past 4 years, in a co-production between the World Service's investigative arm, BBCI, and a German production company, Doc Days, a team of journalists has been investigating the networks involved in moving what is now one of the world's most endangered fish species, the eel, across continents. And in this edition of the Food Programme, we'll be bringing you the findings of that investigation. The presenter of the podcast, Billion Dollar Babies, is Rob Wilson. Now, Rob, this scene we opened with, this intriguing eel-filled plane crash in the Caribbean, that's just one part of a long-running investigation you've been involved in. What has the team been looking into?
Essentially, it started out with the notion that baby eels, also known as glass eels, have become one of the most trafficked creatures in the world, and that's at least what we're told by police and customs authorities. So the team set out to investigate what this means, how it happens, where it happens. It's taken us all over the world, from the Caribbean to Hong Kong, all across Europe. And obviously, with a lot of this trade done illegally, it's not that transparent. But we've been basically trying to get a sense of the often murky networks that are trading in eels.
For people unaware of the scale and the nature of this trade, give us a sense of what you and the team uncovered.
What has really come to light in this investigation is, firstly, how widespread the glass eel trade has become. Anywhere where you find eels, there are people who are trying to get them into the global supply chain. And most of that is directed towards China, which is where most of the world's eels are farmed. But also, the investigation found that the global trade is just really loosely regulated, and there are so many grey areas. So you have organised crime groups who are trying to smuggle eels, and smugglers have confirmed this to us. But one of the most interesting parts of the investigation is that when you look at the legal trade around the world, it operates in a way where it raises so many questions about whether those glass eels could find their way onto the black market and what kind of oversight there is to stop that from happening.
More from Rob in a moment. The investigation he's reporting on for the World Service spans different continents, but there is a UK connection. The team looked into the role of an eel export business based in Gloucestershire and also a consignment of eels destined for Russia, which we featured in an edition of the Food Programme back in November 2025. For a recap on that, and to get an insight into the amazing life cycle of the eel, here's how we reported the story at the time. It's approaching midnight on the banks of the Severn, and in the space of a few seconds, the flow of the river changes.
So, we got this huge body of water in front of us, yeah? When you consider the force of a tide to turn that body of water immediately, yeah? Within a second.
This is Richard Cook, food producer, fisherman, a riverman, and a proud Severn-sider.
Many fishermen years and years ago, yeah, a lot of them couldn't swim. So they tie themselves with a rope to a tree, because if they were fishing or fell into the river, they at least wouldn't float off, you know. And, you know, floating off could mean 2 miles upriver, you know.
The reason we'd gathered on the banks of the Severn last spring so late at night was what that force of nature was bringing through the river. 2 or 3 years ago, near Bermuda, 4,000 miles away, in the warm waters of the Sargasso Sea, adult eels had gathered to spawn, possibly in their millions. Some of the larvae this produced floated along the Gulf Stream and near Europe's coasts. Their flat, leaf-like bodies began a transformation that turned them into glass eels, or so-called elvers. It's in this form, transparent and then slightly pigmented, worm-like and wriggling that they arrive into the Severn, a river with the second highest tidal range in the world.
So these glass eels, they jump on these big tides. There's tides on the Wye, there's tides on the Severn, tides on the Avon, there's tides on the Parrot, yeah. So they're jumping on these tides and they're catching these free rides up the rivers, yeah, to where they want to get to, so as they can develop into eels later in life, yeah.
And where are they trying to get to?
So as the fish come into the river, they're looking to get to ditches, ponds, dikes, headwaters. They want to get out of this main brackish flux of water into fresh water, yeah, where they then can start to, as the water warms up, they start to feed and develop into eels with their black backs and silver bellies.
As the juveniles move beside the riverbank, there are fishermen, such as Dave, another Severn-sider, waiting with the rectangular nets ready to lift the glass eels out of the water.
So what I'm doing there is I'm just dipping my net, waiting for a few minutes and then lifting them out, because the tide's running back out now. They caught a free ride up, now it's going back out, it's too strong from out there, so they drift into the sides. So that's when we start catching them now.
Yeah. Are they on the surface of the water?
Yeah, they won't be very deep. They only tend to go deep when you get a cold air on top of the water, you know.
It's a beautiful place to be, isn't it, Dave?
Look at it.
Full moon.
Yeah, it's
moonlight on the water.
Yeah,
trees around us.
Yeah, it's just magical.
The glass eels that manage to avoid the fishers' nets and make it through the weirs along the river can spend a decade or more in the freshwater habitats that span out from the estuary, feeding, growing, waiting to make an epic return back to the Sargasso Sea. And for millennia, this annual rhythm of the Elver's spring arrival has been an important food story.
My family's interest and the fishermen before and the people of Gloucestershire, or Severn-siders really, the people that live along the river. The arrival of the glass eel, when you talk about hundreds of years ago, it was actually an important source of protein. So it was actually considered a poor man's fish. So the salmon and the sea trout was owned by the aristocracy, by the crown, and the glass eel was owned by the poor. We'd eat it with eggs and bacon.
Yeah. Would there have been people feeding communities as well? So the fishermen would have sold it in
by pints.
By pints.
So Alvers were always sold around Gloucester in pints.
Up to when?
Well, even in my lifetime. When I was sort of in my teens, I can remember glass eels being sold by the pint. I can remember being weighed in tin bars and pillowcases. I remember my father standing there endless hours washing glass eels, but you know, that's history.
History, because since the 1980s, Europe's eel population has experienced a devastating collapse, a decline of more than 90%. The elvers caught along the Severn that night were not for eating or to be sold to farms to mature into adult eels for food. Instead, I was told their purpose was restocking, to end up in other European river systems where eel populations, unlike the Severns, have all but disappeared. Less than a mile away from the riverbank, inside a warehouse-like building on the side of an A-road, is a specialist facility where 1/2 ton of live glass eels caught from the Severn are being stored. Why is that alarm going off?
We have to have an alarm here to measure the oxygen levels and the temperature and the water flow. So, yeah, if the power goes off, then we've got to get down here in a hurry.
In rows of long open tanks, the fish are resting on the bottom. They look like a jumbled mass of tiny, transparent worms. The owner of this business near Gloucester, called UK Glass Eels, is Peter Wood, who's been in the elver trade for decades. He's the only exporter of glass eels in the UK, and so when juvenile eels are fished out of the Severn, this is where they're taken. The number of elvers in this room, how much would this be worth?
100,000.
Until Brexit and the UK's departure from the single market, Peter sold glass eels to eel farms and for restocking projects in European rivers in countries ranging from Greece to Germany and Hungary to the Netherlands, none of which is possible since Brexit. There's one destination he's found to send the eels to: Kaliningrad, in Russia. This is for conservation, not consumption, Peter says. A project that's adding glass eels to the depleted Vistula and Curonian lagoons.
The plan is that it will take some 8 to 12 years before there's sufficient to escape to the sea. Once we've reached that escapement target, it will be possible to harvest some of the fish in the lagoon.
But as you'll hear, there are as many twists and turns in this story as an eel's migration back to the Sargasso, as well as the historic catch of glass eels for food and the more recent supply of juveniles to eel farms and restocking programmes. There's an illegal trade in glass eels worth billions of pounds. And you did hear correctly, billions of pounds.
They don't look like much, but these eels are as valuable to smugglers as cocaine.
Tourists at Madrid airport were caught with 48 live eels in their checked luggage, heading to China. They had these eels in special chilled suitcases.
Recent years have seen widespread unauthorized fishing as Elver prices soared. Riverside cameras set up by one commercial license holder have already spotted unauthorized harvesters this year.
When you look at the monetary returns on the illegal market, it's approaching one of the major wildlife crimes.
Concerns over this international illegal trade is the reason why the UK government recently placed an export ban on the half-ton of glass eels caught from the Severn this spring. The fish Peter Wood was planning to send to Russia.
Tonight is the last night that this business is going to be open. It's finished. I mean, I find it very, very difficult to accept that this, and it really hasn't got home to me. But this is the last day that we will ever trade, and you ought to have a look at the glass eels. You'll never see that again.
DEFRA says Peter Wood's application for the export of glass eels to Kaliningrad was refused because of, and I'm quoting from a statement here, concerns of significant risks of illegal trading, compounded by the current situation in Russia. Peter's response is that he's convinced the eels are being used to restock the lagoon and that he stands to lose up to £30 million worth of business. And for the fishers on the Severn, such as Dave, if there's no longer a destination for the glass eels, they fear that generations of Elver fishing on the Severn could be coming to an end.
Why can't my sons enjoy this, In, 20 years' time when I'm gone, I would like to think of them being down there saying, oh, Dad used to be down here catching this and whatever. So it'd be such a shame if we do lose the fishery.
Fisherman Dave on the banks of the River Severn last year. And that's where we left the story in November 2025. 500,000 tonnes of glass eels caught along the Severn, which, according to Peter Wood, should have been exported to help restock a Russian lagoon stuck inside a warehouse on the outskirts of Gloucester. The UK government, meanwhile, has continued to refuse an export licence for the export of eels to Russia, citing concerns over an illegal trade. Is that justified? And what lies behind those concerns? Rob, this is where you pick up the story in your investigation.
Yeah, the project that Peter Wood describes all sounds above board. And for years, using his private plane, he's taken eels all over the world for restocking. The lagoons in Russia were just one of those projects. But when we started investigating, we really found that there are basically two questions to ask. The first one is whether restocking is really what those eels are going to be used for. And the second one is even whether those restocking projects are the final destination for those eels at all. And we're not the only ones asking these questions. They're also being asked by the fishermen along the River Severn, the people who are catching baby eels and selling them to Peter Wood, including a guy called Shane.
So there's loads of different rumours. There's rumours that they go to Ukraine, Russia, Japan. There's rumours that they go on the black market, be exported. But then there's rumours, obviously, that they get restocked into commercial fisheries. There's rumours that they go for food consumption. There's only certain people know the truth of where they go and what's being done with them. And I think the fishermen would like to know where they go.
The main reason a global trade in the juveniles or so-called glass eels exists is that this wild catch is essential to grow adult eels commercially for food. And Rob, you talked with an expert about why this is.
Yes, that's Florian Stein. He's a researcher at the German Angling Association, and he spent almost 20 years researching eels and eel trafficking.
It is technically possible, but so far not commercial viable, to reproduce eels in captivity because of the complex life cycle.
What he's referring to is the eel's decades-long life cycle that involves migration between European waters or Caribbean waters and the Sargasso Sea. And there's a process of reproduction that isn't really fully understood. No one has succeeded in breeding eels in captivity in a way that's commercially viable. So if you're going to have an eel farm, you have to stock it with glass eels that were caught in the wild. And so each year, when baby eels arrive from the Sargasso Sea, many are caught in rivers for the purpose of stocking commercial farms. And most of these farms are in Asia.
The major market for eel products is Japan. But that doesn't mean that most of the eels are farmed in Japan. They used to be farmed in Taiwan, mostly. Then when China kind of opened up economically, many of the eel farmers moved or expanded into southern China. And then in China, the eel aquaculture kind of exploded. So today, 80 to 90% of every eel from aquaculture comes from China.
The most recent stats show that Chinese fish farms produce around 280,000 tonnes of fully grown eels per year, all to feed the growing demand for eel as a source of food.
Those products in the global market, they are so-called unagi kabayaki filets. So unagi is the Japanese word for eel, and kabayaki is the dish. So you take the butterfly fillets, like both sides of the fish, dip them in a soy sauce mix, and put them on a coal barbecue. It's quite a very traditional Japanese way of preparing the eel.
And Rob, in commercial farming, 3 main species of eel are used, their common names being the European, Japanese and American species, and they've all come under pressure because of this commercial trade.
Yeah, Florian told me that the first place they saw this happening was in Asia, where there was a local species of eel that people would stock their farms with.
So in the first place, the Japanese eel, Anguilla japonica, was the preferred species. But because that stock also depleted, the Asian buyers also bought European eel in Europe. So in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, tons and tons of the European eel were exported from Europe to China.
But then in 2010, because of concerns over the decline in eel numbers, the EU imposes an export ban, and the legal supply to Asia is entirely cut off. And this, Florian says, created the perfect conditions for an illegal trade to flourish.
They are very small, so 1 kilogram of glass eels is about 3,000 fish. That's a very handy kind of commodity to trade. So you can pack them in plastic bags just with a little bit of water, and then you can inflate the plastic bag. And then they can be good for 24, 36 hours. And because of that, it's super easy to transport them in suitcases.
The scale of it is staggering. Police estimate that up to 100 tonnes of glass eels are smuggled out of Europe each year, and that generates somewhere in the region of €3 billion. So we set about looking into how this might be happening. And importantly, Florian didn't just point us towards the sort of smuggling he talked about in suitcases. He also mentioned something interesting about the legal trade they've been monitoring within the European Union.
We saw a lot of suspicious trade into countries like Poland, Lithuania. A lot of eels traded for legal purpose, restocking or farming. But in those Eastern European countries, there's hardly any restocking programs.
And he has a possible explanation for what's happening.
So we have to believe that a lot of those eels going to Eastern European countries were smuggled further to Asia or just across the green border to Russia and then exported from Russia or even used in Russia for farming purpose.
So this is also a part of the world that Peter Wood told us that he delivers to. Not from his business in the UK because Brexit made that impossible, but instead from a company in France. That business buys eels from fishermen there and sells them for restocking in different locations. including Poland.
And Poland is where you headed next in the investigation, Rob.
Yeah, so this is where a Polish journalist called Paweł Zastrzezinski comes into the story, and he's been looking into the eel deliveries to his country. And he's also very interested in the Russian stocking project in Kaliningrad, where Peter Wood's been delivering eels, because Poland borders that territory. And importantly, Paweł heard from some of his sources that eels are often delivered to Poland, but then smuggled across the border to Kaliningrad.
So there's existing concerns of cross-border smuggling in that part of Europe. And it was possible for Paweł to follow deliveries of eels if any arrived.
Yes. And he got a tip about one of Peter Wood's deliveries from France to Poland. So he checked out the official export documents and was waiting for the flight to go ahead when something changed.
According to official documents, the shipments were to go to a fish farm in western Poland. But Peter Wood's team unexpectedly moved the shipment close to the border with Kaliningrad. To certify the transaction, they needed a veterinary number of the farm where the shipment was supposed to go. And so the data of the company and the veterinary number suddenly changed.
Then, the very next day, Paweł saw that Peter Wood's plane was heading to Poland. So he went to the airport to monitor the delivery. Now, on the paperwork, this delivery was for restocking. The wording is actually for release to the natural environment. So Paweł wants to see if that's what happens. The eels are unloaded from the plane into a van, and Paweł follows. And what he witnesses is some of the eels actually being sold to private buyers out of the back of the van on the roadside, while the rest of the delivery was made to the fish farm on the paperwork.
Everything is so ordinary, so everyday, so normal, as if it were an ordinary delivery of bread to a bakery. I saw several people buying these eels for their private ponds. Yes, this is not smuggling. But it is not a conservation project either.
So it raises questions as to how eels can be delivered under the premise of stocking, but then Paweł sees activities like this. It wasn't the smuggling to Kaliningrad that he thought he might witness, but it was the first piece of evidence that what's described in the paperwork might not always match the reality.
And Rob, what has Peter Wood said about this?
So we put these findings to Peter Wood, and he told us that any discrepancies in the customs documents were administrative errors that they then corrected. And he said that it's actually normal procedure for glass eels to be stored by fish farms before release into the natural environment. We also asked the fish farm that was on the paperwork for a response, and they actually denied that any of the eels were sold commercially, saying that they were used exclusively for restocking lakes. And they added that they follow all the relevant regulations. OK, at this point, it's still not exactly clear what's happening to the eels within Poland. So what does Paweł do next to find out? Well, the key thing for Paweł is trying to find connections between Poland and Kaliningrad. And he makes a breakthrough when he manages to speak to a source on the phone who seems to have some good information, but he doesn't want to say much unless they meet in person. So Paweł goes to meet him, and this is where it becomes a little bit like a thriller. The address is a house in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a dense forest.
Oh, this is absolutely horrible. Do you remember like very dark movies with fences, with trees, dark one?
So you went into the house, and he's there in person?
Yeah, with some guy just drinking vodka. Just the sofa was very dirty, you know, just so bad place, you know, just like very scary.
So, spoiler alert, Paweł survives the meeting. And actually, his source gives him an old company computer for a Polish eel farm. And this gives him evidence of a connection between Poland and Kaliningrad. There's pictures of a scientist who seems to have been working at this Polish eel farm, who Paweł recognises. It's one of the lead scientists working at the Russian eel restocking project, the one where Peter Wood was delivering eels to. And when Paweł checked this guy out, he found a research paper the scientist had written, setting out the potential for commercial eel farming in Russia.
In a study, the professor reports that eels, due to the high market value, count among the most economically profitable fish overall. He says they used a small Polish eel farm as a test laboratory for industrial eel farming in Russia.
What is the significance of this, Rob?
So it raises the question of whether the Russian restocking project is really about conservation. And remember, the premise of Peter Wood's exports to Russia were that they were going to a restocking project and wouldn't be used for commercial production.
And Pavel, with the help of a contact in Russia, also looks into the finances behind the restocking project in Kaliningrad, which is run by a company called Goodfish, and their payments to Peter Wood. What does he find?
Yeah, so remember, Pavel has suspicions that eels delivered to Poland find their way to Kaliningrad. Well, Pavel was able to see records of Goodfish's payments to Peter Wood's company. Between 2022 and 2024, they made at least 12 payments in different currencies, which totaled just over $1.7 million US. But Peter Wood only made 3 deliveries to Kaliningrad during this time. And some of the other payments were made around the time that Peter Wood's plane flew to Poland and Lithuania, countries that border Kaliningrad.
The time for the money transfer coincides with when the goods are delivered to Poland. When the plane lands in Olsztyn, the money comes from Kaliningrad. What is the payment for? This is the basic question. If the goods are in Poland, what are you paying for?
Rob, to summarise, we already knew the company run by Peter Wood, UK Glass Eels, had a direct link with Kaliningrad in Russia because he had a contract and was being paid to supply baby eels for a restocking project there. Meanwhile, we also know he was transporting baby eels by private plane within the EU, with some ending up on the Polish border. And your investigation, at the very least, raises questions over how tightly controlled the restocking projects there are. And there's potential risk you identified of eels ending up in illegal supply chains. When you asked Peter Wood if he had any concerns eels being delivered to Poland could end up being smuggled, what did he say?
Well, Peter Wood was very clear in his response. He told us that all the payments from Goodfish were for UK eels, delivered to Russia for restocking, and were fully compliant with UK regulations. He said the deliveries to Poland and Lithuania were unrelated and paid for separately by Polish and Lithuanian customers. We also wrote to Goodfish about this, who told us that their payments to Peter Wood were for fully invoiced contracts for UK eels, and that the number of deliveries didn't necessarily correspond to the number of payment transfers. And they also said that their only goal was to restore the European eel, and denied that any of the eel imports are for commercial use.
Thank you, Rob Wilson, presenter of Billion Dollar Babies on the documentary podcast from the BBC World Service. Let's go back to the source of our original story, the Severn, and the half-ton of eels caught from the river, which the government stopped from being exported to Russia. What's become of those baby eels? For almost a year, they've been inside the specialist warehouse of Peter Woods' business, UK Glass Eels, swimming around in long tanks, being fed pellets, slowly growing and still stuck. Their fate yet to be decided. Dave, one of the fishermen who caught them, wants to put them back into the Severn, but further up the river system. He's convinced that most of the elvers he catches would die if they were left in the river, trapped behind weirs and other human-made barriers, obstacles preventing the fish completing their life cycle. So far, Dave tells me, they haven't been able to agree a method of doing this with the Environment Agency.
It's devastating, really, because I probably brought in 40 odd kilos of fish, 3,600 to a kilo on average. Now, once again, we're talking about a critically endangered fish, and the powers that be won't allow us to help them. How is that right?
However, the Environment Agency has told me they're happy to facilitate the release of the eels by providing guidance and permits. So there's something of a standoff here. Meanwhile, Peter Wood says he's still making applications for a licence to export the eels to Russia, but adds that another option, in his words, is to euthanise the fish. And in another development, to avoid the possibility of this happening again, at the end of last year, the Environment Agency sent this letter to Dave and the hundreds of other fishermen on the Severn.
This year, large numbers of elvers were taken from rivers despite no export trade permits being issued or stocking plans approved. A significant proportion of this catch subsequently perished whilst being held at aquaculture production businesses. We cannot allow this to be repeated. The status of European eel remains critically endangered. The latest scientific advice on managing eel stocks is that there should be no fishing, not even for glass eels, for restocking. We cannot support speculative exploitation of eels without a clear justified purpose. So we will not be sending out application forms to individuals for predetermined overfishing authorisations in January.
Dave says unless he and the fishers can find an approved market for eels, which, following Brexit, is unlikely, or get a permit for restocking eels from the Severn to another location in England or Wales, or become part of a scientific research or monitoring project, that's the end of elver fishing on the river.
I've been doing this for 50 years nearly. Going out every year. You've always been allowed to go out. It's devastating. Devastating.
But the letter does talk about this as an endangered species, and based on the scientific advice as they interpret it, they shouldn't be caught, not even for restocking.
They're critically endangered, so all these fish are stuck now in the river system. They can't get out. We had a perfectly legitimate restocking programme in Kaliningrad. There was no plan B to save the fish. The fish are still going to perish, or 90% of them are going to perish now, because over the years we haven't removed any man-made barriers. Why shouldn't we be doing something to save them? Why should we just leave them to die? You know, the science doesn't make sense.
Elver fisherman Dave. Well, let's hear from one of the experts providing the science.
My name is Caroline de Reef, and I work at the Norwegian Institute of Marine Research. I've been working on eels for more than 20 years, and I am now chairing the working group on eel, which is part of ICES, the expert group, to give advice on eel.
ICES, the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea, brings together more than 1,000 marine experts across Europe and North America to share research and develop science. One of its aims is to match fishing effort in seas and rivers with the health of a population of any given species. And as we've heard, in the eels case, it's been a story of long-term decline.
Depending on if we're in the northern part of the distribution or the southern part, we're at 1 to 10% of what the level was, so before the 80s, to our reference period. So we require some sort of advice, and what we use is the precautionary approach. And we stated in the advice that all anthropogenic mortalities should be as close to zero as possible.
And Caroline, you say anthropogenic mortality, so this isn't just about fishing. The advice is also aimed at reversing the damage humans have done to the eel's environment, such as installing hydropower turbines and building dams, that kind of thing.
It's linked to loss of habitat, and as you mentioned, to hydropower, and then just wetlands drying up, because eels were everywhere. They use all these little streams, and if you think of how much is used now is just dried up, and so there's a decrease in habitat, definitely, coupled with overfishing. And then there's this black box of how much pollution do they acquire during their life cycle when they live in the rivers, and will that affect their reproductive capacity?
Some of which no doubt will take years, if not decades, to reverse. But something we can do immediately, you argue, is to stop fishing eels. So
this is why the advice today is that there should be zero catches in all habitat. This applies to all kinds of recreational, commercial catches, and including catches of glass eels for possible restocking or aquaculture. It's just not sustainable. The level is so low that we cannot allow any fisheries.
That's the science, and what Caroline and her team of fellow scientists are providing is advice. And yet there's still a thriving trade in eels in Europe, and fisheries with quotas set by government. The biggest of which is in France. And monitoring that process is the NGO Ocean Ethic. Its director is Elizabeth Vallée.
France decide on its own quota every year. So for 2026, the quota for glass eels has been decided at the level of 55 tons. Quota for 2026 and 2027 will be 43 tons. This level is still very high.
Very high, but it is falling, so it does reflect an effort to reduce pressure on the glass eels. Why, though, do you think it is that the French government is prepared to ignore the scientific advice and keep setting quota?
Lack of political courage. Because even the fishermen know that there is no future for these activities as fishermen, because there is a large decrease. When the government doesn't listen to scientists and just ignore this loss of biodiversity, it's just scandalous.
Lack of political courage is one explanation. Making money is another. Eel fisheries in France sustain jobs, generates more than €50 million a year, and there's an argument that if managed well, it can be part of a positive relationship between humans and nature. Here's William Decker, scientific advisor of the Sustainable Eel Group, an organisation set up to certify the commercial eel industry.
EU habitats and humans are so closely interwoven, there will always be humans in contact to eels. So to say no eel can be taken at all, it must be zero, is not realistic. What we need to know is what is the minimum level we must protect. If we don't have an eel fishery, then people will pollute. Who cares? But if there is a fishery, there is someone having an interest, someone having the information.
It's an interesting idea of almost conservation through consumption, that we have a stake in the rivers and the fish species because there is that interaction between humans and the fish.
Can I ask you a question? If you leave your house, how far away do you have to walk before you find a surface water?
5 minutes.
Yeah, and that holds for the whole population in Western Europe. If we close the fishery, people will forget about that. When we close the fishery, what you do is you make the eel fisheries invisible. You don't get rid of them. So it is not that I'm saying invest in fishing because it has a revenue, but I do believe humans and eels are so interwoven, we have to interact. Whether we want or not, we will interact. Well, better organize it well.
Most of what we've featured here is focused on the European eel and supply chains of eel throughout the continent of Europe. But as we've explained, this extraordinary fish is a part of the biodiversity of rivers and oceans all around the world. And as efforts to regulate and police the eel increase in Europe, elsewhere, pressure is growing. In the investigative documentary $1 Billion Babies, one of the most powerful scenes comes from the Caribbean. At night, a visit to the beaches of the Dominican Republic reveals a sea lit up by rows of blue shining dots moving up and down among the waves. Each dot is a fisherman in a boat with a big rectangular metal net used to catch glass eels, their head torches illuminating the water. This is a recent phenomenon, fueled by a demand from Asia and the decline of availability in Europe. A boom that's driving a plunder of the oceans and resulting in gang violence and murders. Back to the eel expert Florian Stein.
We've been looking into the glass eel fishery in Haiti, Dominican Republic, etc., and it turns out that there is some kind of national quotas, but no one really cares. There's a few licenses in the hand of a very few people. Those people are connected to criminal gangs. To just make it short, the whole glass eel fishery in Haiti and probably also other parts of the Caribbean is in the hand of criminal organized crime.
criminals in the Caribbean who, in turn, are connected with gangs in Asia, a member of which appears in the documentary, here voiced by an actor.
I am the Duke. I come from a triad society in Hong Kong. We work with so-called agents, middlemen basically. They're responsible for sourcing the goods. They'll notify us when they have a batch of glass eels to sell, but we never ask how they got them. My share is probably between 15 and 20%. I might be able to earn around 1.2 million Hong Kong dollars as a result of the operation in those 2 or 3 days. And we might do this 4 or 5 times a month.
That adds up to £750,000 each month. And in the most chilling part of the documentary, this criminal provides an insight into the level of greed the eel is now up against.
There is a saying in China that goes, all beings compete for natural selection. If something cannot survive in our environment, then they have to be sacrificed so that the entire food chain can continue to exist. I think eventually they will be eliminated. I support conservation in principle, but at the same time, I believe profit often outweighs the value of protection.
You can hear Billion Dollar Babies, presented by Rob Wilson, on the documentary podcast from the BBC World Service on BBC Sounds. And there's also a film which you can find on iPlayer. And on the food programme, we hope to let you know the eventual fate of the eels caught on the Severn, still stuck, for now, inside a warehouse.